This is day 4 of the 2026 Idyllwild Bible School. Our third period teacher is Brother Martyn Lawrence. His general subject is the way of the sea. Today's topic is the Exodus of Exile.
Thanks, Jeff. Morning, everybody. Not bad. It's doing okay. I thought you were going to have faded by this point. This is pretty good. Right, okay. You might remember my business idea from yesterday. Well, a couple of follically challenged members of the audience and I have had a little bit of a chat. And we've developed a line. So we're interested in anybody else who wants to jump in on this particular idea. If you want to share some of these opportunities, we are beginning to ship interstate. There we go. Right, just a quick reminder about where we are. So we're working our way through in the Exodus pattern. We've been in Genesis, we've been in the Conquest, spent some time in the Kings yesterday, and this morning we're going to finish off in the Kings and have a look at how the prophets cast their minds both backwards to the first Exodus and forwards to the second Exodus, which is to come. There's our Exodus pattern, of course. You remember all the things that we've been talking about, and we finished our session yesterday by seeing Solomon's temple complete, and it was done. And I thought I was free for the rest of the week and I could just leave it there, but apparently I had to come back. But it was the new beginning, wasn't it? The Exodus was completed, all seemed perfect. Egypt seems to have faded into the background, and yet, if anybody was susceptible to Egypt, it was King Solomon, right? Come to 1 Kings chapter 3. And we are going to spend most of this morning just working through some verses that, again, you do know pretty well, that will just perhaps be seen in a different light. 1 Kings chapter 3, and you only need the first line in the first verse. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. What do you know? What do you know? And he took Pharaoh's daughter and he brought her into the city of David until he'd finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall about Jerusalem. So he seems to keep her out of sight, at least to begin with. And then if you come over to chapter 7, things move on a little bit. Chapter 7 and verse 8, Solomon's own house where he was to dwell in the other court, back of the hall, was like of the same workmanship. And he also made a house like this for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. Because we like doing that with our sin, right? We build the temple, and we build the house for the king, and there's our religious life sat on one side, and it all looks very shiny and glossy, and our Sunday faces are perfect, and over here is where we put the stuff for Egypt and hope nobody's noticed. So that's what Solomon's doing, making sure that everything is just there but just out of sight. And now we've been through this, you might well catch your Exodus echo about this is another man listening to the voice of his wife. And I said that to the teens just now, and I got this look from a certain number of people in the room, and I had to say the same thing I will say to you, that you don't need to not listen to your wife now, but you understand the Genesis chapter 3 echo, of course. My wife is looking at me and making sure I don't forget. Come on to chapter 9. Because the Lord will appear to Solomon and will warn him about what will happen if the nation through him is not faithful. Come down to verse 6. If you turn aside from following me, you or your children, go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I've given them, and the land that I've consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. And this house will become a heap of ruins, and people will pass by and be amazed and say, what has the Lord done to this land and this house? And then they will say, they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, laid hold on other gods, and worshipped them and served them. Things in Solomon's life are going wrong, and they are going wrong in the way that we would expect by now, because everything is turning back again on the Exodus. Just bring your eye a little bit further down the chapter. Get a record of what happens in Solomon's building projects. Verse 15, this is the account of the forced labor that Solomon drafted to build the house of the Lord and his own house and the millow and the wall of Jerusalem and a whole bunch of other things as well. So Solomon's using forced labor, and we find out in verse 20 that the forced labor comes from foreign nations, the ones who had not been driven out by Joshua, by the people after Joshua. The Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, those are the ones that Solomon drafts to be his slave. And it's weird, isn't it? I mean, I skipped over verse 16, which sits in brackets in my Bible. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, has gone up and burned part of the land and killed the Canaanites who live in the city. So it's really weird, because Pharaoh's acting like Joshua characters should act, and Solomon's acting like the Egyptians act. So everything's going sideways again, and we've got to get our minds around what's going on here. Solomon's making slaves of people not his. He's acting like an Egyptian. Marries Pharaoh's daughter, establishes a standing labor force. Jeroboam is going to be appointed, isn't he, as part of his standing household. He's going to build the store cities, of which there will be 2, just like back in Exodus chapter 1, where the Israelites have to build those 2 store cities, you remember, in order to store the grain. And then come down to verse 26 of chapter 10. Solomon gathers chariots and horsemen, 1,400 chariots and 1,200 horsemen. Where does he get them from? Predominantly from Egypt. Chariot could be imported for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150, and so through the king's traders they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and to the king of Syria. Solomon's acting like an Egyptian. He's gone back to Egypt to reinforce his army. He's established Egypt as Israel's key trading partner. As his reign goes on, as Solomon ages, he's becoming so involved with Egypt that he even looks like an Egyptian. What an unpleasant turn of events for the man who, when the temple is built, and we get all of those comparisons about this has never happened before, like when the days of the Israelites coming out of Egypt. Well, now everything's gone back downhill. And so God is going to raise 3 adversaries against King Solomon, and we find out about them in 1 Kings chapter 11. One of them is just a local gang leader from the north, and we don't find out very much about him. One is Jeroboam, and we'll come back to him in just a second. Another one is in 1 Kings 11 and verse 14, and he's a man called Hadad the Edomite. And even in the very few verses we read of this obscure man, you will see a little microcosm of what we've been thinking about all the way through our studies. Hadad the Edomite, verse 14 of chapter 11, he's of the royal house of Edom. And in verse 17, he flees. Would you believe? Where does he go? Can you believe where he's gone? He flees to Egypt with certain of the Edomites because he's still a child at that time. They set out from Midian, they come to Paran, and then they go down to Egypt to Pharaoh the king, who gives him land and assigns him property and food in Egypt, just like the decent Pharaoh did back in the book of Genesis when Jacob and sons go down into Egypt. Really? I mean, did you see it coming? I mean, you've read the verses before. They just might not have jumped as perhaps they are now. And Hadad found, this is verse 19, great favor in the sight of Pharaoh, so that he marries into the royal line. We're back with the Israelites again. But verse 21, when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers and that Joab, the commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, let me depart, that I may go to my own country. Remember what Moses said on behalf of the Israelites and Aaron? Let us go free. We want to go to our own land. But Pharaoh said, no. And so he does. No. What have you lacked with me that you're now seeking to go to your own country? And eventually the case is made. Hadad the Edomite looks like Moses. I'm not sure that's one I would have seen coming. We know virtually nothing of him other than what we've got here. And yet everything that we're reading of him looks like the Moses situation. The Exodus is unraveling. Israel looks like Egypt, and everything that was perfect is now imperfect. We need another solution. What a strange fracturing of the Exodus narrative. What an unusual turn of events, yet again. And so if it's not enough that Solomon has spiritually taken himself into Egypt, the man who will succeed him, at least in the northern 10 tribes, is going to physically go into Egypt. So still in 1 Kings chapter 11, we read quite a lot about Jeroboam if you read from verse 26 and downwards, but it's down in verse 40 that I just want to bring you. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam, looking remarkably like Pharaoh, or looking remarkably like Herod, maybe, if you cast your mind forward into the Gospel of Matthew. But he goes, and where does he flee? Would you believe it? He goes to Egypt as well, to Shishak, the king of Egypt, and he waits there until the death of Solomon. Everybody seems to go. Everybody seems to need to go into Egypt in order to come out of Egypt to do something special. I mean, we would say God was almost making it up. He's not. Of course he's not. But the Exodus is recycling. Isaiah is later going to say, do not go down to Egypt for help. Do not put your trust in the princes of Egypt. And yet everybody seems to be doing that. So Solomon dies, and in chapter 12, Rehoboam comes to the throne, and the people confront him, don't they? And they say in verse 3 of chapter 12, verse 4, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke upon us, and we will serve you. Your father made us work like slaves, is I think another way of reading that. Please don't make us work in the same way. And then Rehoboam takes his counsel, you remember. He listens to the old and the wise heads. He listens to the teenagers in the teen class, and he disregards the old and wise heads, and he listens to the teenagers. At least that's what I told them when they thought I was talking rubbish. But anyway, you know the reference, and you know the point. And he disagrees with them and says down in verse 11, my father laid on you a heavy burden, I will add to that. So you remember how the Exodus process takes place. Locked in hard service. They want freedom to serve. Pharaoh doesn't listen, and he makes their work harder. The exact same thing is happening as Rehoboam comes to the throne, and they demand release from service, and Rehoboam will not listen to them, and instead will make his work, or make their work, harder. The Exodus echoes are unavoidable, right? Especially when this man then comes galloping up out of Egypt from where he's gone to wait out the rest of King Solomon's reign and come up to cause chaos around them. Verse 12, Jeroboam is on the scene by this point, isn't he? And he comes on the third day to ask the question. And then down in verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, they scatter, every man to his own house, David, and they went to their tents. And of course, Rehoboam then rules over the southern part of the nation, and Jeroboam comes in verse 20, and they make him king over all Israel. And you might just want to catch one single word out of chapter 12 and verse 20. They call him, well, I'm in the ESV this morning, they call him to the assembly. Jeroboam has split the assembly of Israel. The first time that word turns up in your scriptures is back in Exodus 12 and verse 3, when the congregation of Israel come together to eat the Passover before they go out. And now that nation that came together for that momentous event is being split and will never come back together again in the same way that they should have done. So just carry on in chapter 12 and see how Jeroboam solidifies his reign. You remember what he does. He's got this problem that he doesn't want the people to have to come to Jerusalem, because if they have to come to Jerusalem, then Jeroboam's hold on the northern kingdom will loosen. So he decides to set up an alternative system of worship. Chapter 12 and verse 28, he made 2 calves of gold, and he sticks one in the north and one in the south to avoid the people going down to Jerusalem to worship. Your minds will go back into the Exodus, where Moses goes up the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments and to receive the oracles of God, and while he is there, Aaron, well, what does Aaron do? Randomly throws that stuff into the fire, so he tells Moses, and out came this calf. I mean, I didn't shape it, it just appeared, because that's what we do with sin. I just had that internet page open, Lord, and magically there was a golden calf. Sin is odd, right? Jeroboam is going to have an inverted exodus. He's raised to prominence by Solomon, acting like Pharaoh. He will flee to Egypt. He will come back crying the same words that Moses goes with to Pharaoh, let my people go. And the king will not allow it, and then eventually he does. And it's going to be worse than in the days of the coming out of Egypt. Not one golden calf this time, but there will be two. Just come on into chapter 13, because we haven't finished yet, because you'll be looking at this and going, well, Rehoboam looks like a Pharaoh character because he's making the people into slaves. So does that make Jeroboam the liberator? Well, Jeroboam's not a Moses character by any stretch of the imagination, is he? We actually need to look to another place to find somebody who's acting like Moses. It's in chapter 13 where we meet a man of God who comes out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel. We don't know his name, we know very little about him, but he's going to make a prophecy. He cries against the altar by the word of the Lord and says, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son will be born, Josiah by name, and he will sacrifice on you the priests of the high places. And he gave a sign that very same day, behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Now, that's not an easy thing to understand when I drop it on you without any warning, and we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of kind of unpacking what's going on here. But just take from this that this man of God is coming to confront Jeroboam. This altar is going to be split and will be ground to ashes underfoot. In just the same way that when Moses comes down the mountain and they see the golden calf there, the tablets of stone and the calf are ground into ashes underfoot. This man of God is looking like Moses in the face of not one but two Pharaoh characters who are setting up their thrones in the north and in the south. And strangely, just like Moses will be generally a faithful man. No, that's underplaying it. Moses is a marvelously, magnificently faithful man. But who, as the years go on, sins, you remember, by striking the rock twice, and doesn't complete his journey into the promised land. So too, this man of God, later on down chapter 13, is going to go on a journey. He's not going to do what God asks him to do. It's down in verse 18. He lies to the people who are speaking with him, and his journey is interrupted. It's down in verse 24. It's a bit like the Tower of London story. The lion met him on the road and killed him, and his body is thrown into the road, and the donkey stands beside it with a lion watching over it as well. This is a man who's looking like Moses, who goes on a journey, but it doesn't finish. Just like Moses. Different kind of guy. Different echoes. Not as strong a character as Moses is, but we're just seeing these little things sat there and helping us to shape what this Exodus story is all about. If you come into chapter 13 and verse 10, it's just there on the screen down at the bottom. God will draw a line under what will happen in the days of Jeroboam. It's need to jump in the middle of a sentence, really. Chapter 14 and verse 10. I will bring harm, the Lord says, upon the house of Jeroboam, and I will cut off from Jeroboam every male, bond and free in Israel, and I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as a man burns up dung until it is all gone. Jeroboam, you might recall, has two sons. They are named Nadab and Abijah. If your Exodus antennae are up to their fullest extent, you might remember, of course, that Aaron has two sons. Well, he has more than two sons, but he has two in particular, Nadab and Abihu, who offer strange fire before the Lord and are themselves burned up and consumed. We're just getting another flag in the ground, aren't we, about God telling us that this is an Exodus process working itself out, inside out and back to front. The entire life and circumstances, both of Rehoboam and of Jeroboam, are living out this very message for the Lord. Even the messengers of God are repeating the sins of the people. And so, on the story goes, as it unravels in this remarkably Exodus-like shape. And the Lord, verse 14, will raise up for himself a king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam, and the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. there's Moses in the reeds, right? When he sets sails, when he's pushed out in the water. And root Israel up out of this good land which he gave to their fathers, scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have provoked the Lord to anger. And he will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned and made Israel to sin. And there is this, well, we need to not miss it as an awful event in its own right. When somebody's child dies, let's not just read over that as being, well, that's what the Bible says. But verse 17, Jeroboam's wife arose, she departed to Tirzah, and as she came to the threshold of the house, right there in the doorway, there is no Passover angel to save this firstborn son. And Jeroboam's child dies, and all Israel buried him and mourned for him, according to the word of the Lord. Jeroboam's sins are reversing the exile. Reversing the Exodus. They're going to go out of the land and back once again into captivity. And isn't it significant that the last thing that we read of this man's reign, down in verse 25, is that in the 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came against Jerusalem, and he plundered it and took away all of the stuff, just as the Israelites once had plundered Egypt and taken away all of their stuff. Kingdom failures are repeatedly being cast in Exodus and freedom language. We are repeatedly being asked what it means to be free. We are repeatedly being called upon to make sure that our Exodus is complete. That if we have come to the mountaintop, that it doesn't just last until Saturday afternoon or Sunday when you get back home, but that it's something that goes on. That we remember that we've been called to freedom, that Christ has set us free, not just to do whatever the heck we like, but to bend our wills in service to him. These people came to the mountaintop and were only there for the view. And off they went again. Saul looks like Pharaoh. David exiles himself in the days of in the time of Absalom. Rehoboam acts like a pharaoh and enslaves people. Jeroboam's life takes on this bizarre Exodus-like shape. Everything is Exodus-like, and it's not a surprise anymore. Now, it's not all bad. Don't misunderstand me, because there are certain kings, particularly of Judah, whose lives will look remarkably like a positive Exodus story. So take the days of Jehoshaphat, for example. When Jehoshaphat prays for salvation, when his nation, when the nation are trapped by the enemies, and in that very day says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. It's a callback to what Moses says when the Israelites are by the Red Sea. Not the Red Sea, the Reed Sea. And God will deliver them, and they will sing songs of triumph, just as we see in the Exodus story. Or take the days of Joash, when Athaliah, the usurper, tries to kill all the baby boys. And again, we don't want to just pass over that and pretend that that's not a real-life event and desperately tragic. But it's an Exodus echo as well, isn't it? And Joash is hidden by the king's daughter, just like Moses. And Joash will ultimately reign 40 years and bring rest to the land. There are Exodus ideas just circling and recircling. It's that story we talked about yesterday of the character in the play who just peeks out around the corner and waves and says, remember me? And disappears again until the next act, and it's there. Take the days of Hezekiah, when Sennacherib's army comes down. And the angel of the Lord passes over the camp of the Assyrians. There is a battle of the gods, just like there was back in Egypt, when Sennacherib is overthrown. And they, in that marvelous King James Version phrase, woke up the next morning and they were all dead men. But God is working in the lives of his people. Exodus shapes are all over the place. And in some ways, things are good. Sometimes things work out in a positive way, but not all that often. Chapter 21 of 1 Kings. You're going to recognize this when we get there. This is when Ahab wants Naboth's vineyard. And you remember the significance of that promise that when they came into the land, they would sit, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, And Ahab looks for this vineyard, which is right up next to his palace, and he says, I want your vineyard. I want to turn it into a vegetable garden. I want to grow zucchini or something random. And I'll give you a better vineyard, it seems, or if you want that, I'll give you money. But Naboth says, it's my inheritance. It's a fulfillment of the Exodus promise. It's not just that I like the land over there better because the view's good or the crops are better, but this is what God gave me in the Exodus. And so Ahab has a strop, doesn't he? Has a paddy, has a tantrum, and he lies down and he turns his face to the wall and he won't eat anything. And Jezebel eventually tells him that he's allowed to go and take it because she's dealt with Naboth in this awful way. Ahab wants to systematically reverse the Exodus. It's a reversal of the inheritance laws. He's an anti-Joshua, isn't he? He's a man who wants to turn the conquest back on its heels. In fact, when Naboth is dead and Jezebel tells Ahab to go and claim the land, you come down to the end of verse 16. Look at the exact expression which is used. Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. That's conquest language. That's what God tells Joshua to do. That's what Joshua tells the individual tribes to go and do, to go into the land and to take possession of it. And he's going to, can I invent a new word? He's looking to re-Canaanize the land. Everything is going backwards now. The inheritance is the inheritance of the conquest is being untied and unknotted. What an awful thing. What a difficult situation for God to bring upon his people. And all of this, of course, is going to be played out. We'll skip one or two of the other things on that bullet point, but everything is being played out against the backdrop of faithful prophets. All the time that these kings are trying to decide for themselves what an exodus should look like, trying to turn things upside down, trying to reverse history, trying to re-Canaanize the inheritance, Elijah and Elisha are there in the background as those Moses and Joshua characters that we've talked about in other sessions, trying to push the Exodus back in the right direction. Only it doesn't happen. Because it's ultimately going to fulfill the promise that God made through Moses back in the days of Deuteronomy, that when they were not faithful, everything about the Exodus would be systematically reversed. Can I bring you to Deuteronomy chapter 28? And there's more than one application of Deuteronomy 28, I think, of course. But if you come down to verse 58, this is part of the warning about what will happen if they are not faithful. If you are not careful to do all the words of this law which are written in this book, that you may fear this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, then the Lord will bring upon you and your offspring afflictions, severe and lasting, sicknesses grievous and lasting. What are we being told will happen to the Israelites? That they're going to be given plagues. God is going to plague them just as he plagued the Egyptians for their unfaithfulness. Verse 60, he's going to bring upon you all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, because, back when they were in Egypt, God kept them safe from those diseases, and nothing fell upon them. But now it will. Every sickness and every affliction not recorded in the book of the law, the Lord will bring upon you until you are destroyed. And other things are going to be turned backwards. Verse 62, you were as numerous as the stars of heaven, but now you will be left few in number, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God. Verse 63, you will be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of it. You will be disinherited systematically because of your unfaithfulness. Verse 64, you're going to be scattered among all people. You will worship other gods that I never knew, just as they did before the Exodus, before Abraham, back the other side of Euphrates. Remember that phrase from Joshua? Your fathers worshipped other gods on the other side of the Euphrates in days of old. You're going to go back through the waters, symbolically at least, and worship those other gods. You will have no rest which of course God was going to bring them in the Exodus. And verse 68, he's going to bring you back to Egypt, but not through the waters, not through a God-given way of the waters being parted so that you might see what God does for his people. It'll be done in a man-made way. And there you will offer yourself as for sale to your enemies, as slaves, and no one will buy you. All the way back to the beginning of Exodus, when they are made slaves in Egypt under Pharaoh. But you will choose to do it for yourself, and nobody will take you. That there are few things more sad and desolate than a slave that wants to be a slave, but that cannot be bought. What an awful situation they are bringing themselves to. And so the prophets will rail against this, and will speak about what will happen when they go as a nation into exile. Because exile is what Exodus looks like in reverse. And we can just begin for a few moments to cast our mind forward to the things that the prophets, both in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom, were saying, when the nation would not only reverse their exodus piecemeal in the days of some of those kings, but would systematically go into exile, first in the north under the Assyrians, and then secondly in the south under the Babylonians. In fact, all of the exile books will begin to call back to the days of the Exodus. They'll do it in different ways, in fact. Got lots of textual comparisons between what it's like, what the Exodus will look like, the way in which God will begin to fulfill this. But then there's lots of comparisons made in the Exodus, just in the prophets, just as we've seen already. You know, person A looks like Moses, person B looks like Pharaoh, in the same way that we've been moving through. In fact, most of all, captivity in Babylon is going to look like captivity in Egypt. Remember Psalm 137? You remember a different song, not the triumph song of Exodus 15. Sing to the Lord, for he's triumphed gloriously. But you remember Psalm 137? By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, there we wept when we remembered Zion. They're singing of having crossed another river. By the rivers of Babylon, we've taken ourselves into exile. Everything about the Exodus is about a water crossing that brings you into the land. Everything about your discipleship is about baptism that brings you first into wilderness and then into a land. They took themselves into exile and sat by the rivers and wanted to go back again. And God said, how many times do I have to tell you? This is what you keep getting wrong. And so the prophets will call back to the national exodus. And this is a whole other Bible school, right? So, we can do this again in however many years' time you want, right? So Hosea will speak of this, about how God has called his son out of Egypt. Amos is going to talk about the sacrifices that they made for 40 years in the wilderness. Joel speaks of how Egypt in the future will be made desolate as a mirror from the past. Micah will speak in the last days of how they will be redeemed from the house of slavery, about how God casts all the sins of his people into the depths of the sea as a mirror of what God did to the Egyptians. Habakkuk, in that glorious psalm, the song that Habakkuk sings in chapter 3, speaks of how God tramples upon the seas, as he did in Exodus 14. Jonah's going to take himself into exile on purpose. He's actually going to be a prototype of the nation. I would rather go into exile somewhere else over the seas than I would serve God in this place and speak forth his name. And God says, you want to take yourself into exile? I'll show you what goes wrong. And the storm comes, and down he goes into the depths of the sea. Brian was talking to us a couple of days ago about the Lord. Was it this morning? My time zones have completely collapsed. Talking about that storm on the sea where the disciples find the Lord asleep. And it's a little echo, isn't it, of the days of Jonah. And by right, they should have picked the Lord up and thrown him into the sea to fulfill the Jonah story. But they don't, because the Lord's sacrifice will come in a very different way. Haggai will speak about the covenant that God made in Egypt. They are all calling back to the national exodus, but they're doing more. They're looking forward to a second exodus which is going to come. And this is complicated, and we're not looking at all of the details. I just want to lay it out before you. The way in which Jeremiah will tie together both the first and the second exodus of the people of God. The way that Jeremiah 31 will speak of the new covenant being better than the old one, like it was in the days when I brought your people out of Egypt. Ezekiel will speak of a new exodus. Zechariah will speak of a new exodus and Israel being brought from Egypt again and from Assyria. Now, there's loads there. Don't worry. I don't want you to take it all in. I just want to try to paint a picture of what the prophets are doing, that they're not just telling the people about stuff that God will do, but everything is being hung on this peg. All of the language of salvation and of condemnation is being written in this particular way, so that you might look at your exodus and say, I need to make myself free in the way that the scriptures call me to be. In my life and yours, we need to get out of Egypt and stay there and stop looking back and stop painting those pictures of what it was like to be in Egypt, because it wasn't better there. And the leeks and the melons and the garlic and the onions and the cucumbers were not better, even though we keep kidding ourselves and pretending that they were. There's going to be another character who will appear on the scene when the nation go across the waters into exile. His name is Ezekiel, and he's going to look remarkably like Moses. He's a Levite who gets commissioned by a river and sees visions of the glory of God. It's not quite like the burning bush, but the vision, the theophanic vision, if you want a technical word at this time in the week, which is quite brave of all of us, is right there, isn't it? He's sent to a rebellious nation. There will be signs and plagues played out in the life of Ezekiel like there were in the days of Moses. And as the prophecy continues, he'll get instructions for worship and how to count and order the people. He's going to be brought to a high mountain. Isn't that remarkable? And he will be given a new law and instructions for new feasts, and there will be a survey laid out. And I'm not telling you which Christadelphian interpretation of Ezekiel 40 to 48 is right. You will have to have that conversation over coffee. But he has the picture, doesn't he, of what that temple looks like. The temple and the city and the land. He's going to live the life of Moses while he is in exile, and we will see that prophecy and see those same ideas reworked again. And then they'll come back. And if Ezekiel looks like Moses, hopefully your mind is going, well, is there a Joshua who brings the people back into the land? And there is. And just to make it really easy, because it is Thursday and it is warm, he's called Joshua. He's a high priest. So he comes back into the land with the people. And again, we start to see an exodus being played out in front of us. And even the exile writings themselves will just point us in the direction of the exodus. So you take the book of Esther, which seems on the surface that it will have no comparison, no point of reference to the exodus. But you've got a Haman character who's actually an Amalekite, interestingly enough, who will act eerily like Pharaoh and try to oppress the Jews. You've got Mordecai, who looks a bit like Aaron because he's related to Esther, who of course is going to be the one who intercedes for the people. Mordecai is just going to keep an eye on what happens to Esther, just like Aaron keeps an eye on what happens to Moses when they go to the king's court. And then in the narrative exile books, in Ezra and Nehemiah, it's a new exile, isn't it, that comes from Babylon. They will make offerings. There will be a new Passover. They will renumber the people. There will be a call for separation. It's Exodus everywhere. The entire shape of your Old Testament is reminding us that freedom means everything, that the Lord bringing his people through the seas is a prototype for your life and mine, that your decisions about who you talk to and where you go and the kind of things that you look at online and the mindset that you might have about certain things that we see on our TV screens indicate to us what our lives are like in an Exodus-shaped way. Do you want to come through the waters and stay there, or do you want to go back in the wilderness with the sand? And I tell you what, as our Old Testament runs to its chronological close, and Nehemiah 13 just lays before us an interesting little situation, and I'm going to test myself to find Nehemiah now at this point in the morning. But right there at the end of the prophecy of Nehemiah, there is a condemnation once again on the people. They're actually, despite all of this stuff, all of this new exodus which will happen as they come back, build the house, and everything looks great again. Well, Nehemiah 13 is a final condemnation on all that we've seen in the Old Testament. What Nehemiah is asking them to do is to rededicate themselves. There are these final reforms, aren't there, which he carries out. But there is this intermarriage that takes place with the nations round about. I brought you here, but actually we're not going to look at any verses, sorry, but you can pick it out in verse 23 and further down. And Nehemiah is incensed by what happens. They've violated everything. And as we get to the end of the Old Testament, even this promise of Exodus is unresolved. And you know, it seems that the reason this metaphor is so overwhelming, and you will be seeing it in your sleep as you go home next week, but the reason this metaphor is so overwhelming is that it's God's guarantee of what happens in the future. That there will be another Exodus for the people of God. We see it in part in AD 70. That the people have come back, and this condemnation that Nehemiah is speaking of in his prophecies is ultimately going to work its way out with the Jews of the Lord's day when he speaks of the temple falling again. That they will go again into exile. That the Exodus again will be turned on its head. But if he can speak of that coming in the future, then he can speak again of a future Exodus for the people of God. And that might mean that the Elijah character who will come may be a desert prophet, like the original Elijah. He might work his work in the same way before handing over control to the land prophet, the Joshua prophet, the king who will come back again in the earth, the Son of Righteousness who will rise with healing in his beams. How that will work its way out, well, we have lots of ideas, don't we? In the way in which that character may come. Well, whatever it will be, that new Exodus will eclipse the Exodus of old. It will be greater than the days than when God brought his people out of Egypt. It will not be a flight in hurry, in darkness, and in fear. It will be a glorious and a triumphal procession.